After landing on an island near the Antarctic Peninsula on November 13, 1820, American sailor Henry Palmer and his men dubbed the island Deception Island. For the longest time, what transpired over the next 2 days was puzzling and unreal. Palmer steadfastly resisted releasing the grisly details, finally disclosing the unsettling incidents that occurred just before he died in 1877. What transpired 137 years later, when a team of Australian scientists went on the island, was even more horrifying and increased suspicion about the island. The events that occurred in 1957 were kept a secret by the Australian government for decades before one of the scientists, American-born Richard McCrae, eventually broke his silence about what happened there. This is Henry Palmer's story, which has been transcribed into modern English as I set foot on the shore of what I later named Deception Island. Should be left alone. Uninhabited research stations have been set up and abandoned over the years due to various reasons, some of which remain unknown. Unease took hold of me. As a sailor, I had walked on many beaches over the years, but I had never experienced the sensation of being watched. I knew there shouldn't be any people on the island save for some wildlife, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone or something was there. Knowing that it would soon be evening and that we had not yet explored the area, I told my men to camp just above high tide. Luminosity every morning when we set up camp on a new shore. We count the number of people who have disappeared during the night. I still recall the first morning when, as I was drinking my coffee, someone yelled out, "Norris and Clark are gone." I hurried over to their shared tent, looked inside, and saw that they were missing. I quickly called everyone over and set up 4 search parties to quickly search the island for them, telling them to prepare their weapons. I chose 2 other men to go with me, and we all set off separately. The other men and I talked about where they might be and what might have happened as we made our way along the beach towards a rock formation. One rule I have is that nobody leaves camp without telling me or my first mate George where they're going. This includes when they're going to relieve themselves. We never know what might be lurking in the uncharted territory we explore. After a spell of walking, we came across what appeared to be human footprints in the sand and clothes belonging to one of the men. There was another detail in the sand that piqued our curiosity right away. It seemed like drag marks from something being pulled, and not too far in the distance. We saw a cave at the base of the outcropping of rocks, precisely where the Edward's footsteps led us to the cave. "Be ready with your rifle, something looks strange to me," I said. "Sir," he replied, raising his rifle to his shoulder. I took my handgun out of its holster and cocked the hammer back. Said nothing as we got closer and closer to the cave, but I could tell there was a lot of tension in the air because these men were sailors, not warriors. I had fought in the War of 1812 and had witnessed a lot of deaths, so I regrettably developed an apathy that had followed me my entire life. I also developed a sense that enabled me to predict when something terrible was going to happen to me. It was a curse and a burden to bear. Being the leader of these men, I decided to enter the cave first even though I wasn't ready to kill them. I could see that the cave went away back and that there was only a faint light coming through. So before I took my first step inside, I took a deep breath. At moments like these, I was always terrified, but I never disclosed it to my soldiers. As soon as I entered the cave, my suspicions proved to be correct from the beginning, and I never got used to them. As I continued pushing myself forward, keeping my pistol ready in case something came rushing at me, I heard a gurgling noise followed by what sounded like raspy breathing. As we got deeper into the cave, it was getting too dark to see, so I told my men to light their candles. No sooner had we done so than I heard what sounded like moaning and something moving about. But I was unable to make out what it was. I pressed on until I came to a sharp stop. Veer inside the cave, I turned to face my men and said, "Men, be ready. I have a feeling whatever it is close." I tried not to show fear in their eyes as I spoke, but I knew something was approaching. I kept walking, turning the corner, and as I did, I suddenly stopped and saw Norris and Clark's naked bodies lying on the ground. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Their skin had been completely removed and it appeared as though I stood there, unable to identify who was who because their bodies were turned inside out. Suddenly, the man closest to me looked up at me, raised his arm, opened his hand, and said something that I couldn't understand. I quickly walked over to him and knelt, noticing a sheer tear in his eyes as he looked up at me. I held the candle next to it and saw that it looked like a stone, nothing more. It had a brilliant red color to it, unlike any red I've ever seen. Edward leaned down to pick up the same red stone that he was holding, but he appeared to be dead at that moment. I stopped him, saying, "Edward, don't touch it. We have no idea what it is," and he jumped backwards against the wall, asking, "What happened to these men, sir? I have no idea what ungodly could do this to a man. Nothing on this earth that I know of." To which I replied, "You too, go now fetch the rest of the men. And return these men's blankets so we can transport their corpses back to the camp for a thorough examination." We were supposed to stay on the island for 6 days. But as I waited in the cave for the men to return, a feeling of dread overcame me and I knew we had to leave the next day. The men soon arrived, and when they saw Norris and Clark's skinless bodies, they crossed themselves and prayed. Some of the men thought it was the devil, while others said it was witchcraft. I was unsure of whom to trust. I simply knew that we had to leave the island, so I told the men to wrap their bodies in the blankets and carry them back to camp. I also told them not to touch the red stones. Once we arrived at camp, we examined the men's bodies for any clues as to what might have happened, but we were left with only more questions. Later that afternoon, we buried their bodies. And the events of the next day confirmed that I would never, ever go back to Deception Island as long as I lived. As the men finished their breakfast in the morning, I told them to break off from campus as soon as possible. A few of the men approached me and said they had to relieve themselves. So of course I agreed. As I was packing my belongings, I heard one of the men yell, "Palmer, come over here." I dropped what I was holding and started walking in their direction. As I got closer, I noticed one of them was pointing to something, so I stopped and looked over it. To this day, I can't even begin to imagine what had happened there. Clark and Norris. I quickly disregarded my initial thought that one of the men had dug up their bodies because I knew these men were utterly terrified of what had happened and would never do such a thing. "I've never seen my men move so fast as we pack up camp," I said. I could hear them saying various things about what they thought it was as we left. I'll never forget someone saying this island is an evil place and should be left alone, is something I'll never forget. Returning, I gave it the name Deception Island in the hopes that it would discourage others from going there. This is a story I was told and threatened not to discuss about the events that occurred on Deception Island in 1957, but I don't care anymore because I owe it to the men who died there. They were my friends for years before it all happened. There were 5 of our stations there, and since ours was built not too far from an active volcano, the weather was generally warm, with occasional temperatures as high as. The first week after we arrived, the temperature was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't until the 8th day that it started to rise. I recall that night when my 2 friends and fellow scientists, Ian and Ross, returned from a day of exploring the island with sediment samples from the volcano and other interesting items they found. They called it that because they were both GE list members, waking up very late to use the restroom. They were still in the room where they would study the samples they collected. Was a little strange, so I assumed they might be just excited about what they had discovered. They were standing very close to each other, facing away from me, and whispering something. I didn't think much of it at the time, and it wasn't until much later that I realized it was just the beginning of something sinister. That morning, as I was making my way to the mess hall for breakfast, I passed by the room again and saw Ian and Ross standing in the same spot I had seen them late the previous time. "Hey guys, have you been standing there all night?" I asked. They turned to face me and just nodded, not saying anything. I stood there for a while, waiting for them to say something. But they turned back around. I wondered, what the hell is up with those two? As I made my way to the mess hall and saw Peter and Max eating. After getting my breakfast and sitting down with them, I asked, "Did you guys talk to Ian and Ross about this?" When I tried to talk to them this morning, they just turned their heads and nodded without saying anything. Maybe they're just overly excited about the rocks they've found. "You know how giddy geologists get about rocks they've never seen before," replied Max. "The morning they're acting strangely." "No, I saw them standing there in the room. Why didn't I talk to them?" "Yes, Peter, I may have mentioned that we had breakfast in stillness. As a marine biologist, I plan to spend the day searching the beach for different marine life, so after breakfast, I walked back to my room to get ready for the outdoors. However, as I walked past Ross and Ian's rock room, as I call it, I noticed they weren't there. I then went to their rooms to see if they were there, but they weren't. As per station protocol, when someone leaves the station, they should notify someone of their whereabouts and when they plan to return. I talked to Peter and Max about it, and they... Later that afternoon, when I returned to the station, Max and Peter were standing there staring at me. I immediately knew something was wrong because Ian and Ross should have returned by now. They knew the protocol, so I dismissed it as them just forgetting. That day, as I made my way along the beach picking up and studying various marine life, I kept looking over my shoulder. I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched and felt like someone was right behind me. What should we do? I inquired. What can we do? As it will soon get dark and I don't feel like going outdoors and exploring the island after dark. Peter, no, I don't, but we should. Max said, I don't know what the hell, and I nodded in agreement. It's going to be cold tonight, and they might be dressed warm enough to survive. Let's wait here in case they do come back. If not, we'll wake up early and head out right before first light to search for them, Peter said. They believed they knew better than this. That evening, while we were eating dinner, none of us spoke much. I'm not sure what was going through their heads, but mine was racing. I also didn't sleep much that night and had the strangest ideas as I lay in bed. That evening, Peter came to my room very early and said, "Let's get dressed and go find them." We spent the entire day looking, but I said nothing as I jumped out of bed and started putting on clothes to brave the bitterly cold Arctic weather. Discovered no sign of them, so we made the decision to try and radio for assistance. After returning to the station, we dialed Max to reach someone on Livingston Island, who informed us that help would be sent, but it would not arrive until the next day. They also promised to radio our Australian headquarters to update them on the situation. We went to our rooms after supper because we had been hiking all day. I was tired, so I quickly fell asleep. Someone cried to me, "Help me!" Became alarmed and sat up. When I heard someone shout again, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or not. I couldn't make out who was shouting, but I quickly jumped out of bed, grabbed the lantern I always kept in my room, and headed down to Max and Peter's rooms. As I approached Max's room, I heard what sounded like teeth chattering. I slowly raised the lantern as I entered Max's room and exclaimed, "What the hell, even now I have a hard time." Unbelievably, I saw two men standing there, neither of them had skins on, eating Max. When they realized I was there, they turned to face me. I quickly turned around and hurried to Peter's room, yelling to Peter to get up. Since Peter had always slept deeply, I wasn't shocked when I went into his room and found him still asleep. I gave him a hard shake and told him to wake up because we had to leave. Max has experienced something, which I will elaborate on later. What are you talking about? What the heck is going on? I asked Peter. Grabbed his arm and started yanking him out of bed, but as soon as I saw the expression on his face, I froze and turned to see what was behind me. "Get up now, Peter," I said in a horrified tone. No sooner had I said that than they began to approach. I hurried to my right, trying to get as far away from them as possible, but this only made them stronger. I backed up against the wall and watched as the two skinless men before me grabbed a hold of Peter and started biting and removing fragments from him. I've never heard more horrifying screams than I did coming from him. I made the decision to run and get the fire axe we had in the hallway so I could help him. However, as I turned to leave the building, one of the men turned to face me and began to charge me. I panicked and, instead of getting the fire axe, my flight mode took over. I started walking towards the mess hall and had the idea to hide inside the walk-in fridge because I knew it would be cold there. There was a rack holding down jackets we would wear outside, but I didn't care because I was willing to take the chance. As I ran down the hallway, I happened to pass it and grabbed one. Once inside the mess hall, I made a beeline for the walk-in fridge, opened the door, and ran inside. I didn't waste any time pulling one of the twins out of a box of food so I could tie it to a friend's handle and a heavy shelf that was inside. After tying the twine, I put the down jacket on and retreated. Door soon after arriving, I heard what sounded like scratching and something trying to open the door. Whatever it was, it seemed very strong. And I watched as the twine was stretched to what I assumed was its limit, praying that it wouldn't break. This continued for a while until I decided to turn off the lantern, leaving the interior pitch black. I then sat down in the corner, huddled up, trying to stay as warm as possible. My pants weren't appropriate for the cold, so I The last thing I remember before help arrived was being startled awake and barely being able to hear someone yelling, "Hello? Is there anybody here?" I stumbled over to a friend's door and started beating on it, saying, "Hello, in here, I'm in here, hello in here." "We're the ones you talked to yesterday requesting help," Jorgen said in a thick Norwegian accent. I turned the lantern back on and then went back to the door. When I untied the twine and swung the fridge door open, I saw Jordan standing there, which was the most welcome sight of my life. I asked him if he had seen the skinless men when he arrived. And he looked at me puzzled as if he didn't understand my English. He then replied, "No, we haven't seen anyone else since we arrived. We found 2 rooms with beds covered in blood and red stones but nothing more. I guess not, I'm the only one left." As he'd mentioned, as we passed the rock room, I looked down at the floor and noticed the same brilliant red-colored stones scattered about. I don't know why, but I got the inclination that the red stones had something to do with what happened. Of course, I'll never know for sure. Once the Australian government learned of what had happened, they sent a special team from Australia to investigate. I could see blood everywhere as well as the red stones on Ross and Ian's beds. Years later in Australia, McCree was working in his yard when a man approached him and asked him a number of questions about what had happened on the island. He said he was from the special team that went to investigate after the disappearance of the scientist and that they also ran into some issues while they were there, but he would not elaborate. McCree asked him if he knew anything that would bring him closer to the truth. After weeks of searching, nothing was ever found. Closer were Man Jast Syed, Island Under the Wood. Subscribe to 4 twisted terrifying horror stories.